This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. All right, welcome back. This is episode 4 of Kosmographia. Is that how we're going to say it?
We decided that's the way we say it.
It's not Kosmographia, but Kosmographia. We are here with Mike, the man of mystery and microphones. Bradley, the official show observer, and relative size guy, the stander of ledges. And, of course, the man of the hour, Mr. Randall Carlson, who has a dog walking behind him. Hello, pups. What's up, Randall?
Well, I'm here. I guess one of the dogs wanted to get in, but changed his mind at the last moment.
And we are, of course, the hosts. I'm Russ. This is Kyle. We're hosts of Brothers of the Servant podcast, and we are here hanging out with Randall every week doing his podcast. This is so, Randall, the first thing we should bring up here is this near miss we had. So I've got the MIT Technology Review website pulled up here. It says the asteroid managed to get, a huge asteroid flew very close to Earth last week. How did we miss it? Asteroid managed to get within just 73,000 kilometers or 45,360 miles of our planet without anyone noticing. The miss lends a new sense of urgency to preparations for a potential collision one day. So have you looked at this? Was this an asteroid or a piece of a comet? Was it really an asteroid?
I think it was an asteroid.
Okay. You want to share that? we're going to do a screen share real quick. And they've got a little graphic of the orbit thing here. We'll pull it up.
Let's check it out.
Well, and even some of them are calling it a city killer, which is really not going to be very big. You know, the Tunguska object was 150 feet maybe, and that leveled 800 square miles. So, you know, that would wipe out a large city, no problem. So it really doesn't have to be that big of an object to be a city killer.
And just maximize that. Can you guys see this? Is it filling up the whole screen there?
I got it.
You see the orbit? Orbit's moving?
Yep.
That's close, though.
Yeah. It's not playing the whole video for us, though. You can see the asteroid down there, 2019 OK, and its orbit.
Oh, yeah, it keeps resetting.
Yeah.
That's what it was doing, though, when I
I
was watching you play it. It's a short video.
Anyway, but it's easy to find. You guys can go find this video. It's been all over the place, and you basically can watch that asteroid sort of sneak up on Earth from behind.
So what was the answer to the question? How did we miss it? Has anybody come up with an answer for that yet?
That's a good question.
Well, because it's small.
Yeah, that's true.
And you think, excuse me, Randall, you think the Earth diameter is, roughly 8,000 miles. You're looking at 45,000 miles. So that is,
yeah. So that
5 plus Earth diameters, that is really a close buzz.
Yeah. So MIT Technology Review says it's hard not to feel concerned that a city killer size asteroid wasn't detected further ahead of time. It was announced just hours before it passed by Earth after being detected a few days beforehand by teams in the U.S. and Brazil. Its relatively small size, unusual orbit, and fast speed all conspired to make it tough to spot, researchers said.
Mm-hmm. Well, like Brad is pointing out, they're calling it a city killer, but, its range of size, the higher end of the range was 427 feet in diameter.
Yeah.
So let's say that it's 400 feet. If it was at the higher end of the spectrum, if the diameter is 400 feet, the radius is 200 feet. The radius of the Tunguska object was, say, roughly in the neighborhood of 75 feet. But the thing is, its volume, assuming that it's a roughly circular object, scales by the third power of the radius. So you would have 4/3 pi r cubed, r being 75 cubed for Tunguska, and then you would have, if it's up to 200 feet radius for this object, then you're looking at a volume of roughly equivalent to 19 Tunguskas. If it was at the higher end of that.
Right. That would have been more than a city killer, because
that's more than a city killer. Yeah. If it's at the higher range, which it could have been.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about a 15 megaton bomb, For Tunguska, then this is up in the neighborhood of 285 megatons. So 285 megatons is 285 million tons of TNT. And
give it to us in black hats.
Equivalent to, let's say that would be equivalent to about 28,000 Hiroshima bombs.
Whew. Oh my gosh.
So that's more than a city. That's a state killer.
Yeah.
That would basically take out, maybe not a state the size of Texas, but one the size of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina.
Well, that would mean it could take out a number of small nations around the world.
Yes, it could take out, yes.
Definitely.
And if an object like that struck the Earth, we would literally be picking up the pieces for a decade or more.
And if it hit the Pacific, it would wipe out multiple nations the size of Texas.
Well, if it hit the Pacific...
That's where I was going.
Yeah, the thing is, here, is the object at that scale, at that size, let's say it's 400 feet in diameter, is it going to penetrate the atmosphere and strike the ground, or is it going to blow up in the atmosphere like Tunguska did? That's going to all depend, mostly depend on the density of the object.
Yeah, right.
If it's a lower density object, it could fragment, and then really what you've got is like a shotgun blast, and it would be really more devastating over a larger area. Because for one thing, if it hit the ground, now the ground absorbs a lot of that energy, which of course would get translated into seismic energy and certainly cause earthquakes within the vicinity.
Yeah.
And probably some pretty nasty earthquakes out to a radius of a couple of 100 miles. But nonetheless, the radius of destruction would be less at a ground impact than an atmospheric. That's why, when they bombed Hiroshima, the bomb didn't fall and hit the ground and blow up. It was time to blow up in the atmosphere so that the radius of destruction would be much greater. Right. So the point, I think, being is that an object this size, if it was 400 feet in diameter, that would be a major catastrophe. It would not cause any mass extinctions. It would not cause the end of human civilization. But what it would do would be to basically give us a real solid kick in the ass that would take maybe even decades to recover from.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well,
considering like we're not fully recovered from Katrina yet, really. I mean, the infrastructure of New Orleans hasn't been brought back to what it was, right? At least the last time I checked in a few years ago.
Yeah.
But don't you think the impact it would have would depend on where it hit? If it hit New York, or if it hit Silicon Valley, that could be a civilization disruptor.
Well, you're right.
If it hit Moscow,
there'd be the EMP function too.
Yeah.
I mean, it could take down the communications grid maybe around the whole planet.
Yeah. I mean, it would definitely be a civilization disruptor.
Yeah, a major disruptor. Yes, it would. It would. And if you had, if it's like came in over a populated area, you would have millions upon millions of casualties.
Yeah.
You would. I mean, if it came over the eastern seaboard, that's...
So the term city killer, frightening in and of itself, is really doesn't do something like this justice.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In one of the articles I was reading about this, they were saying that, well, we really don't track things this small. They're the ones they're concerned about traditionally have been the kilometer size or greater.
Yeah.
Those are the ones they're tracking. They don't track things in this range. Right.
And that's one reason it was missed. And here's the thing. In terms of likelihood of encounters, it's the potential frequency would be much higher for an object this size than a kilometer object.
Yeah.
But, and here's the other thing too. Sometimes these objects may come in swarms, or they may come in pairs. They may come in swarms. You might have a collection of objects. I mean, at some point we could talk about the Great Meteor Procession of 1913, which was probably a half a dozen to a dozen Tunguska-sized objects that skimmed the Earth's atmosphere and went back out into space.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, eyewitnesses' accounts of these lines going across the sky.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if that thing had come in at a slightly steeper trajectory, boom,
Yeah.
it would have wiped, because it passed right over Montreal and New York, Boston, all of that area in there would have been decimated in 1913.
Yeah.
And one of the big questions is this new, or have they always been passing by this close regularly forever, or is something changing within the cosmic environment that there's more of these, and we're fortunate that we're actually looking out there and being able to see some of them and forecast, even though this one was small enough we didn't see it very far ahead of time, are things increasing where it's important that we are watching?
Yeah, that raises a question too. The graphic you showed an orbit for it, which means it's got some periodicity to it.
Yes.
So how many
Crosses
times?
Earth's orbit twice. It just at this particular time, Earth was there when it crossed the orbit.
Yeah.
But it will be back again.
Right.
And how close will it be next time? How close was it in the past? We don't know, because, like as Brad said, we're looking for these things now, and we still miss this one.
Yeah.
Well, and a big one came through, right at 2 months ago. It was back in May. There was one that was over a mile wide, and it had its own satellite that was a third of a mile wide, and it's on a 6 month plus orbit around the sun, 180 some days. I mean, that's fascinating to me that's out there too. But we did find that one, and we are able to track that, and like the graphic showed, we can determine its orbit and when it'll be back. And they don't say it's on any Earth colliding trajectory anytime soon. They haven't pat that out. But a mile object with a third of a mile satellite just came by 2 months ago. This is regular news.
I didn't hear about that one. Wow.
That would be a major planetary disruption there.
Major.
Yeah. People would really be worrying about their safe spaces then.
Yeah.
That passed by three. It was about three. I read it earlier again. 3+ million miles away. So
Right.
not really a danger, not that close, but still, those kind of objects are out there, probably times.
Yes.
A couple hundred times 1,000.
And those are just the asteroids. The NASA, they don't watch comets yet. They're not really looking for cometary stuff yet in their sort of near Earth object database. They're looking for asteroids only. And so the fact that they also that they're not looking at the comet stuff and they missed this asteroid. It's asteroids and you didn't see this one.
The danger of comets is not so much a comet coming in and the nucleus of the comet striking the Earth, although that could happen. The danger of comets is comets coming in that then get trapped into a Jovian orbit, which sends them ping-ponging back and forth between Jupiter and the sun, and then they begin to disintegrate.
Right.
And so they begin to litter their orbits with debris. And if the Earth's orbit, or rather it creates a meteor stream, within that meteor stream there may be multiple Tunguska-sized objects and up. And then the Earth can cross this stream if it precesses in so that the two streams intersect. So that to me is really more the danger of comets. And the thing is, it seems like the more that we learn, the more it seems like there's no clear-cut dividing line between comets. It almost seems like comets and iron asteroids are two endpoints of a continuum.
Right.
It's fully populated between there. And there are things that almost look like hybrids that look like asteroids, but probably came originally from a disintegrating comet nucleus.
Right.
Yeah, like the asteroids are all of the
volatile gases,
the volatiles,
and ices.
the crystals have evaporated or sublimated off of them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a devolatilized comet nucleus might be indistinguishable from an asteroid.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Well, you guys have seen Armageddon. What did the guy say in there? The guy that was the head of NASA in Armageddon. He's talking about when they were asking him, "How did you miss this thing that's coming to kill us all?" And he was like, "Well, Skywatch budget allows us to look at about 2% of the sky, and begging your pardon, sir, but it's big goddamn sky.
Yeah, but wasn't now Armageddon? That was where the object was the size of Texas, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Now we're not going to miss an object the size of Texas.
Texas is pretty freaking big.
Yeah, that's pretty big.
Miles.
I mean, maybe you could do this for a mile-wide asteroid, but not the size of Texas. That thing is going to be showing up, way out there. We're going to
unless it's got some crazy low albedo for whatever reason, and no one can see it. And even then, you should notice it.
Right, you would, and yes, you would probably notice its gravitational perturbations as it's coming in to the solar system.
Great movie.
And both those implausible. But listen,
debunking my favorite movie, Randall.
When the piece of it hit France and pulverized Paris, that was a pretty cool sequence. Remember that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that I want those movies pulverized, but
they came out. What was it? Year and a half after Randall's documentary that was on TBS and CNN. A dozen times. Those movies were about a year later. And there were some statements made by the president, they were almost verbatim from the documentary. Morgan Freeman said a few things on, summarizing the state of things, and it sounded exactly like Randall's documentary, Fire from the Sky.
Wow. Huh. Did not know that. Learn something every podcast.
Yes. Maybe it was a coincidence.
I get a new nickname.
Coincidence, man.
Then there was the Mission to Mars movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard Hoagland has a good story about that.
Oh man, yep.
I bet. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a couple of interviews with Richard, and yeah, we got a story where he and I met. God, had to have been 20 years ago, I guess.
More than that now.
More than that now, yeah. And
I love Hoagland's work. I've always been fascinated by the stuff he looks at. Sometimes it looks like he's diving off deep ends, but hey, somebody's got to dive off deep ends.
Somebody's got to dive off those deep ends,
That's right? That's right.
If you're willing to do it, go for it, Richard.
Go for it, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm sure we could find the podcast. I think I've done 2 podcasts, but one of them we discussed extensively the Mission to Mars thing and the Viewmaster set, the Viewmaster reels.
Yeah.
It had the whole story on there. It was basically Richard's whole scenario of Mars that he had come up with. And then he was in town, and I had breakfast with him, and I said, Richard, after breakfast, I said, I've got something to show you here. And I loaned him this set of Viewmaster reels that I'd had since I was 4 or 5 years old. And it was a story, it was, everybody of my generation, well, the Viewmasters were still around when you guys were kids, right? You remember the little 3D?
70s.
Yeah.
You had the round, and you would put the reels in, and then you would go through and click.
I must not have been able to read because I didn't know they were called that.
it's got Viewmaster across the top.
Well, that's what they were called. And are they still? I guess they're still around. They still make them, but it was a very popular toy when I was a kid. And so one of the set of the reels was this Tom Corbett Space Cadet. And Tom Corbett Space Cadet was, I think, if I remember right, it was the first ever science fiction TV show. Like 1951, 52, something 53 right in there. And the science advisor to it was Willie Ley, who was also instrumental in the space program, and he was a bona fide astronomer and scientist. So it had some very interesting sort of multi-level stories to it that were more scientifically varied and interesting than some scriptwriter might have come up with. But so basically, Richard had come up with the scenario of this whole Mars scenario, and then for the most part, it was identical to the story that was on these little reels, right? And he'd never seen that. So he flipped out when he saw that. And he even said himself, he spent the next year trying to track down the source of that and couldn't really find it. But they're online now because I'm quite sure that Richard posted them on his website. And if I put in Tom Corbett, there I'm seeing the little stills that I myself may have actually scanned, 10, 15 years ago. because he couldn't find any other copy. He spent a year trying to track down another copy. The company that made the Viewmaster reels was Sawyer Toy, and they got sold out to somebody. So he went through and tried to track down the origin, and he found one old, elderly, retired woman who had once worked for Sawyer, and she remembered that, but she couldn't remember where, it had come from. So basically, he was looking at this, and it was his whole, in detail, his whole scenario that he'd worked out for Mars, right? So it's like somebody beat him to the punch, and he wanted to know who it was, but I don't think he ever got to the bottom of it. But then
in 1951.
But yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, that story totally obsessed me. And yeah, it did, because I used to I had my Viewmasters, and I had there was a movie that came out in the early 50s called Animal World, and they had a sequence in there where it was stop motion dinosaurs, right? And I don't know if you remember the late Ray Harryhausen, who he pioneered all of the stop motion animation that you saw in the 50s and 60s. Like if you ever saw any of the Sinbad movies or stuff, where you basically, he would make a movable puppet, and then they would move it and shoot a frame, move it a little more, shoot a frame. And that was the whole, up until CGI came along. And in fact, they actually were using stop motion in, I think, the first Star Wars movie, if I recall.
Yeah, for some of it, yeah.
Yeah, you can see stop motion, like I know they used stop motion in like the first two RoboCop movies for the robots. They were stop motion puppets and things.
Yeah.
So Ray Harryhausen, he was sort of the dean of that. And they did a whole animated sequence of dinosaurs in this early in the animal worlds. And then, it goes through, and you've got the Brontosaurus, and you've got the Stegosaurus, and this and that. And then you got a fight between two Allosauruses. And then they come to the end of the Cretaceous, and it's the T-Rex, the obligatory fight between the T-Rex and the Triceratops.
Right.
You got to have that, right? The T-Rex, the Triceratops, right? He's got those two horns and the big, right?
All the plates on his
They're
back.
just about to get into this big fight, and then all of a sudden, they don't say this was pre-impact, but what they're describing in there is precisely what would happen. Everything started, the earthquake started, the sky caught on fire, the volcanoes started belching out, and that was the end of the dinosaurs. And the whole scenario was definitely catastrophic. And, the last few scenes where, the red blazing sky and the ground is opening up and the dinosaurs are falling into it, right?
Yeah.
So that was like my obsession. I used to stay home, fake being sick, so I could stay home, and I would go in my room, and I would shut the door, and I would adjust the shades on the window, prop the pillows up on my bed, and I would get my Viewmaster out of the closet, and it was all in a box, and I would get it out and take out the reels that I wanted to watch. And I would sit back, and I'd just spend the afternoon in that 3D world, when I'm 6, 7, 8 years old, right?
Yeah.
So it was Tom Corbett Space Cadet, the Animal Worlds, and then the other two that were my four favorites were 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Jules Verne story.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, incredible story, which ultimately led me to probably reading every single thing that Jules Verne wrote by the time I was in middle school. But there was that, and then the final one was Stories Out of the Arabian Nights.
Right.
Which, of course, to anybody who's studied esoterica or spirituality knows that the Arabian Nights were devised as Sufi teaching stories.
Yes.
So they're all analogous. And so those four, and I always had a few that I would have to go through first to get out of the way before I got to the four essential ones. Chili Willy the penguin, Woody Woodpecker.
So do you guys
I
ever
hurry through Woody Woodpecker to get to the dinosaurs?
You guys know the comic book sort of satirical superhero, The Tick?
Yes.
He used a Viewmaster for crime detection.
Wait, I didn't get that. What?
Yeah, so there's a superhero called the Tick.
The Tick. I've heard of that. Okay.
Yeah, so his superhero thing was he was basically invulnerable, like ticks are. You just can't freaking kill them, right? He was basically invulnerable to damage, but he was completely insane. But he thought he was a good guy fighting crime, and so he would climb up to the tops of buildings, and then he would pull out his Viewmaster that had pictures of dinosaurs in it, and then he would put it on and start clicking through it, and this is how he detected crime. He is completely crazy, so he'd be looking at dinosaurs, and he'd be like, oh my god, there's a crime. And then there would actually be a crime there somehow, and he'd go down there and then do crazy tick stuff.
Whoa, this is a clue.
This must have been, I think this was after my time.
Huh.
Maybe. The Tick was hilarious. He was sort of a satirical play on like all the superheroes and how all the, he's got this huge giant square chin, and he totally thinks he's a hero, and he wants to save.
Okay, I recall seeing that now. I do.
He's got he wears a blue, skin tight suit with 2 antennas sticking off of it, and he basically completely screws everything up. But because he's invincible, no one can kill him, right? And he gets into ridiculous situations. He tries to jump in to save the day, and he ends up falling through everything and making giant holes and stuff. But anyway, I just remember when you said Viewmaster, I was like, that's what the Tick used to detect crimes. That was the first thing I thought of.
Hey, I'm going to share screen here.
I'll put a plug. Meanwhile, I'll put a plug in for the Tick on Netflix. Check it out.
All right, great.
So somebody was connecting, though, that these former Viewmaster programs were foreshadowing in some way. Somebody knew that.
Right. That is the idea.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh man, that's cool. That's one of your slides.
Yeah, that's. I think that's the last scene.
Yeah, they're all.
Oh my God! The earth is cracking open, and the dinosaurs are falling in, and
and it's like 3D. I mean, that was part of the appeal.
Oh
right?
yeah, that was
they were 3D.
The 3D effect.
Yeah.
If you didn't have the 3D effect, it wouldn't have been so compelling.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to get a 3D monitor. So now you can turn the shades down in your house and put the 3D monitor on and look at your old Viewmaster pictures.
Yeah.
We'll get a Kosmographia Viewmaster in the store. People will be able to buy one and watch Randall's slides.
Revived.
Yeah. You can get the entire Atlantis slideshow in a Viewmaster set.
I'm not
well,
seeing.
when the 4G, 5Gs go down, it's going to have to entertain people with something. So you better have your Viewmaster reels ready.
So where were we from last week, Randall, on Atlantis? We had just do you remember what slide we were on?
I'll show you this last thing. I think people might find this interesting.
All right, cool.
This is a scene from the Tom Corbett Space Cadet.
That's great.
Now, here's what you got to understand.
In the background, there's pyramids.
If you've ever been into Richard Hoagland stuff, he's all about tetrahedral physics, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so here it is on the moon. They've found this. This is actually on an asteroid. They have found this truncated tetrahedron.
Yeah, he's got the pyramidion in his hand. Yeah, he's holding the top of it.
That's the capstone.
Right.
And
yeah.
Well, I guess if it's should we put it on there? Of course we should put it on there.
Well, because when they do, trying to see here how I can. Okay, I don't want to.
Dude, those are great spacesuits. Yeah, they're good spacesuits.
Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Really good reflections on the bubble helmets too.
Right.
Well done, man.
Trying to see how I can.
Try to go to the next picture or what?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Down on the right. Down.
Yeah, out to the side. There's an arrow there. There you go.
There it is.
All right, here we go.
He does put it on there.
Okay, you see that? As soon as he does, the tetrahedron becomes transparent, and what do you see inside?
Yeah.
A 3D map of Mars.
Right.
That shows here where they hid the crypt.
Yeah.
Where the ancient civilization hid the crypt and buried the crypt, and it's the entrance to the crypt is guarded by a lion-headed sphinx. So see all of these details. It's pretty much totally Richard's story.
Yeah. Look at that space guy in the background there, man. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, the 3D version of this is really pretty awesome, I gotta say.
It's like a galactic cluster right there.
So search Tom Corbett, people.
Yeah,
Tom
and see,
Corbett.
here's the genie taking the palace to Egypt. See this? And you see the 3 pyramids there?
Yeah.
I think that's where my fascination with pyramids started, with this right here.
That's awesome.
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, those 3D, they were pretty cool. It was my favorite. And you know what? It's the only thing I still have from my childhood. That's it. Somehow I managed to hang on to that thing. Lost everything else over the years, but I've still got that. Yeah, I've got things now, or had things that I've seen online, or if I still had those things, I probably could have retired. Like I inherited a whole set of these, they were called Big Little books. They were from the 20s and the 30s. They were real popular during the Depression. So my dad, when he was a boy, he in the late 20s and 30s, he got this whole set of these Big Little books, and it was like a complete set. So I've looked online, and just those things are now, original versions of those are worth a lot of money.
Wow.
So okay, so
yeah, do you remember where we were at in Atlantis?
Segway.
Yeah, where were we at in Atlantis?
Speaking of inheriting ancient things.
Yep. We were talking about sort of the academic view of Atlantis.
That's right.
Yeah, and we didn't get too much into it.
The academic view is it's all myth, right? That's something Plato made up.
That's right, basically. He was going through the Atlantis fact or fiction.
Fact or fiction.
Yeah.
So,
Dorothy Vitaliano in 1978.
Yep.
Yeah, and at the end, he sort of held forth and just destroyed all their arguments, and so we were going on from there.
Okay.
Right. Then let's see. We ended up with this guy, Vyacheslav. He's a Kudryavtsev. I cannot pronounce.
No problem. We will.
Is that okay?
I'm sure we'll have a long tradition of butchering strange names on the podcast.
Okay, so if I mispronounce his name, it doesn't shoot my credibility all to hell?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, so we were talking about whether Plato's account of Atlantis was fact or fiction, and whether or not, whether he intended it to be taken as fact, or whether he was taking it as an allegory of his idealized state. And I think there's some element of, certainly, I think you could say he himself said at least 3 times in the 2 narratives that it was fact, that it was a veritable story, that it was to be believed, it wasn't made up. On the other hand, I could certainly see that he could take a story, just like we do today. We might take a historical event and allegorize it for whatever, making some moral point or whatever. I mean, it doesn't, to say that there might have been some literal meaning behind the story doesn't mean that he couldn't have used it to illustrate some idea, some concept that he was trying to get across, even a metaphysical concept.
Right.
Right. So,
and just to jump back, we recommend that people find the Benjamin Jowett translation and read Timaeus and Critias.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Timaeus, and I think the pronunciation would be Critias. I think that's going to be a preferred.
Timaeus. And also to say what you said, Randall, but the other way around, because this is how I always think of it, is just because Plato was putting in like a metaphysical or allegorical meaning into that whole thing doesn't mean there isn't a literal thing behind it, right? That's basically what you said, but
exactly,
in reverse.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That is exactly what I'm saying. So the Russian guy has some interesting ideas, like they all do. He says that, and this is in his 1997 paper that he wrote called Atlantis, a New Hypothesis. He's talking about, he'd been talking about, a lot of scholars, if not the majority of scholars, believe that Plato meant it allegorically. But then he's talking about, and he says that others who do not consider Plato's narration to be an invention persevere in trying to interpret it in a way which would make it possible to link it with the already explored archaeological sites. Thus, some of them contend that none other than the island of Crete is Plato's Atlantis, claiming also that Greeks used the name of the Pillars of Hercules mentioned by Plato, not for what is now called the Strait of Gibraltar, but for some rocks which were situated on the way from Athens to Crete. And I think that's where we ended it last week. So then, because that's probably the most popular of the ideas now, that if Plato had any literal idea in mind, or if there was a literal or actual history to Atlantis, or the idea of Atlantis, it was really the destruction of Minoan Crete.
The
or
Santorini,
a variant on that, the destruction of the island of Terra by the eruption of Santorini, or on the island of Santorini, the volcano Terra. So then he goes on to say that given such an interpretation, it becomes imperative for them to bring the date of the vanishing Atlantis given by Plato in line with the time of the decline of the Minoan civilization established by archaeologists and link it to the explosion of Terra on Santorini. Hence rise is given to the hypothesis that the span of time between the vanishing of Atlantis and the conversation between Solon and the priest is actually 10 times shorter, and that the mistake was made either when Egyptian priests were copying the sacred records, or because Plato himself, like all his contemporaries, had little sense of time and dating.
What?
I don't know. I find that to be
a bit condescending.
Yeah, a bit condescending and very questionable assumption.
Bunch of savages don't know how to count time is basically what.
That savage Plato doesn't know how to count time, right?
Yeah.
Even though this author goes on to say, and obviously lower sea level is taken, it can be seen that in the area of the present Azores and Canaries, which are most often pointed to as the remains of the sunken Atlantis, there had been no sizable land. So what he's doing there is he's echoing the book Atlantis Fact or Fiction and the few other articles and papers that came out purporting to say that there was no geological basis for any sunken landmass in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. So my point last week was that, and just like he's making here, if coming up to those late 60s and 70s in this shift when oceanography and marine geology really became a thing, this is when you saw this shift where previous to that, most of the stories, books, and things about Atlantis put it in the mid-Atlantic, obviously and naturally, because it's so clear that that's where Plato was pointing, right? Post, say, 1978, after Atlantis Fact or Fiction, that's when you see the Atlantis researchers going all over the world, picking out this place or that place that in one detail or another does not conform to Plato's narrative, and so they have to make these assumptions that, well, no, he really meant this when he said that, kind of thing. Whereas I say, no, let's just go back to the original account. But here this Russian author does make an excellent point here. He says, and this was the word that was used in Plato's accounts, the word nasos, probably would be none, epsilon, sigma, omicron, sigma, as I'm guessing would be the spelling of it. I have the Greek back there on my shelf and I could look it up, but the point is
NESOS or NESOS.
NESOS, yes, in the Greek. So in the original it would have been nun. It would either have been an epsilon or an eta in the second place, sigma, omicron, sigma. The Greek word nesos or nasos, used by Plato, quite unambiguously is translated as island. And I have no reason whatsoever to assume that once upon a time it could have had another meaning as well. In the same vein, the Latin word insula does not seem to allow other interpretations. So is it possible to equate that area of land in the west of Europe with Plato's Atlantis? I believe it is. And there are two possible explanations of why the word, which means island, is used for something that actually was not one. So here he is. He's admitting that Plato used the word for island. He's then putting Atlantis in northwestern Europe and comes up with his explanation for why the word Nasos, which means island, which was used by Plato, was actually meant something else. Okay, so what I'm saying here, my point being, is we could go through all of these various accounts, right, that deviate in one detail or another, or multiple details from Plato's account. Now, the question I would ask is, how far can we deviate from it where we should even be thinking, why are we calling this Atlantis?
Right. They're doing mental gymnastics to try to get some other place because this other book, the Fact or Fiction, and this geologist basically said it's geologically impossible for it to be in the Atlantic, and so everybody starts doing backflips and cartwheels trying to put it somewhere else, right?
Exactly, backflips and cartwheels. That's what we've been seeing ever since the 70s, basically. But yet here is the opening quote from Timaeus, and this is Critias talking now, because he's the one who's relating the tale to the Socratic Forum there in Athens. Then listen, Socrates, to a strange tale, which is, however, certainly true. So right there, right at the outset, we're establishing this is a true story. As Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages, declared. So he was a relative and a great friend of my grandfather Dropidas, as he himself says in several of his poems, and Dropidas told Critias, my grandfather, that would have been Critias the elder, who then told it to his grandson, Critias the younger, who is now presenting the tale. So that's the sequence there from Solon to Dropidas to Critias the elder to Critias the younger. Now this is being told in the Socratic Forum. That's where Plato hears it and writes it down.
Right. And so for those people, those guys, all of those people they had high standing. It's like citing scientists.
Yes.
In other words, so these days they can be like, well, those guys were just Greek philosophers or whatever. But back then they're like, no, these are the most respected.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to get across that those guys were highly respected in their time, and that's why citing them is a big deal and saying this is a true story.
Yes.
Okay.
So we go back to Solon in his sojourn in Egypt, where he heard the tale from Sonchus, the elderly Egyptian priest. And this is generally going to be around roughly 600 BC, right? So we can say, again, roughly 11,600 years from Solon's time to our own time. He goes on to say that there were of old great and marvelous actions of the Athenians, which have passed into oblivion through time and the destruction of the human race. And one in particular, which was the greatest of them all, the recital of which will be a suitable testimony of our gratitude to you, and also a hymn of praise true and worthy of the goddess, which may be sung by us at the festival in her honor. So that was one of the things, that they would have these festivals and they would recite these poems, and these poems would be these epic tales that had been handed down. See? And
again, this is the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon. That's
yes, this is the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon.
Right. Okay.
And people might go, well, hearsay, blah, blah. But see, a lot of time people who don't understand about how knowledge was transmitted is it was an oral tradition.
Yes.
And the way those oral traditions work is you learn rote.
Right.
You become a storyteller. You have to learn those stories perfectly, because the idea is you don't change a single detail, right? Because if you change a detail here, somebody 2 or 3 or 4 hearings subsequent is going to change another detail. And then eventually, what's the game we used to play when we were kids? You'd sit in a circle and you'd whisper in the ear, right? What do they call that? There's a name.
Line, that's what I thought it was called.
What was it?
Telephone,
whatever. Right. But the point here is that, you're transmitting from the priest, right, now to Solon. That's one transition, to Dropidas, Critias the elder, Critias the younger. So you're looking at basically 5 transitions between presumably highly intelligent men who would have been able to remember the details and pass on pretty much exactly what they heard.
Right.
So
already trained in this idea, yeah.
In one of the quotes I read last week, they were speculating, that that the story got, all blown out of proportion in the telling from the priest to Plato. But I would say that that's highly, highly unlikely to have happened amongst that chain of individuals there from Dropidas to Socrates. So then Socrates says to Critias, well, very good. And what is this ancient famous action of which Critias spoke not as mere legend, but as veritable action?
Huh.
Yeah. Of the Athenian state, which Solon recounted. Then Critias replies, I will tell an old world story, which I heard from an aged man. For Critias was, as I said at that time, nearly 90 years of age. Now, the day was that day of the Apaturia, which is called the registration of youth, at which, according to custom, our parents give prizes for recitations. And the poems of several poets were recited by us boys, and many of us sang the poems of Solon, which were new at the time, see? So that was his introduction. If Solon had only, like other poets, made poetry the business of his life and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, which he didn't do, and when people read Critias, you'll discover that when the decision is going to be made to destroy the world and the gods get together for their conference, you're like, okay, now what happens? Boom, the tale ends right there. Yeah, it's a very frustrating. It's very frustrating.